We'll go ahead and get started. All right, I'm Nick Monroe. I'm the Accessible Tech Coordinator with the Center for Accessible Resources. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about getting started with some accommodations at the Center for Accessible Resources at Lane Community College. We're located in Building 19, Room 263A of the main campus. So if you're familiar with campus at all, we're across the Sky Bridge from Building 1. You can find our webpage at lanecc.edu/disability. You can contact us at accessibleresources@lanecc.edu, and our phone number is 541-463-5150. This meeting is being recorded tonight, and we'll probably try to get it up on our webpage fairly soon after it publishes, so you'll have available access to it after this recording. All right, so a little bit about what we're talking about today. We'll do some welcomes and introductions. We'll talk about CAR's mission, some differences between K-12 and college, Lane's steps to enroll, CAR's services and role in the college, getting started with CAR, working with CAR, resources that are available to students, and we'll take some questions at the end. So like I said, I'm Nick Monroe. I'm the Accessible Tech Coordinator at the Center for Accessible Resources. Also, we have here with us Maria Alonio. Maria, do you want to give a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you. Yes, my name is Maria Alonio, and I am one of the lead and administrative specialists up at the front desk. I'm usually one of the first people that either students or faculty or staff or other people will contact with our main number. As Nick had mentioned before, our main number is the 541-463-5150, or our email address of accessibleresources@lanecc. You will probably be having me either reply back to you or contacting back to whoever contacts either of those. But yes, thank you for being here today.
All right, so CAR's mission. The Center for Accessible Resources mission is to provide equal access and remove barriers to various learning environments through reasonable accommodations so that all students can be active participants in the LCC community. CAR strives to promote inclusion while fostering student independence, resilience, and self-advocacy skills. CAR works to advocate for disability as an important element of intersectional identity and human diversity. CAR works with students and faculty to determine appropriate academic adjustments and services for students with disabilities, and partners with the LCC campus community to provide education, resources, and support with an emphasis on universal design and inclusive environments. So a little bit about some differences between K-12 and college. We'll start with the student role. So there are some, before we get into what's here on the slide, there are some pretty big differences between how accommodations are handled at the K-12 level and at the college level. At the K-12 level, student is identified by the school as needing some supports or academic adjustments. The school also arranges all of those accommodations, and then that documentation assessment piece is used to determine those accommodations. While at the college level, the student does need to self-identify as needing services. So it's a student-driven process. Students help arrange accommodations through the interactive process. And then supporting documentation is used to fill in gaps of the student's narrative about their learning. All right, so what does that mean? So at the college level, we're really much more geared towards focusing on access versus success. We view the learning environment as creating barriers for students with disabilities as the student interacts with that environment. And we really take a social model approach to disability, viewing the learning environment as the challenger barrier, not necessarily the student. And then accommodations are meant to remove or reduce those barriers. So when it comes to curriculum in K through 12, curriculum can be modified and may include broad modifications to test, assignment grading, deadlines, etc. In college, accommodations can't do anything that would fundamentally alter the curriculum. So accommodations are designed to remove those barriers, like I mentioned previously, to learning and ensure classes and materials are accessible. But like I said, they can't fundamentally alter curriculum or learning outcomes for a given class. At the K-12 level, because of the IDEA Act, which guarantees a student right to their education, that much more means that accommodations are geared towards that success piece. And in college, we're much more focused on removing those barriers and providing access. So accommodations at the college level are specific to disability-related barriers. Presenting and aren't broadly applied. They're very much on a case-by-case and specific basis. So there might be some situations where even if an approved accommodation is established, if it were to come into conflict with the learning outcomes of a class or of a specific assignment, then that might be a situation where those accommodations are inappropriate for that particular situation. But if that is the case, we typically work with the student or the faculty to try to find some either strategy or alternative to approaching that given assignment or exam. All right, so before applying to CAR, we ask that students complete Lane steps to enroll. So one, we ask that students complete the admission application. There is an online form found on the lanecc.edu webpage. We also ask that students complete the course placement survey. Number three, we ask that students claim their LCC email and satisfy any requirements of LCC's vaccine policy. There are going to be some updates to that from what I understand going into fall term. So definitely keep an eye on any LCC communication via the web page, and then any emails that come through regarding that, as things I think are going to be changing there a little bit. Then the students will want to complete orientation. It's currently online, but there are going to be some in-person options available over the summer. So keep an eye out on the LCC webpage for that. And then register for first term of classes. So it's really important that all of these steps get completed before applying for CAR. Having these steps completed really adjusts the time frame for meeting with folks in our office and speeds it up. There might be additional meetings required if some of these things aren't completed yet. So more information can be found at the college's steps to enroll in admissions, which can be found on the webpage, like I mentioned. So CAR services enroll. So we kind of break it down into a few different categories. So the first category is accommodations. The second is service providers. Third is accessible tech. And then the fourth is testing. So typically accommodations that would fall into that in-class environment, but it could also encompass some of these other areas as well. Service providers would be like readers, aides, scribes, or ASL interpreters. Accessible tech might mean something like a smart pen or audio recorder, or textbooks that read out loud with a text-to-speech or text-to-speech program. And then testing might be anything from like a reduced distraction testing environment to some extra test time. So as far as our role, we establish accommodations for Lane students and then address any concerns regarding access. Identify and refer students to LCC and community resources, assist with any learning strategies that might need to go along with those things. So there might be a referral to tutoring or retention counseling for some of those more in-depth strategies around like executive function or early outreach or mental health and wellness if there's a need there. And then we also provide faculty consultation as needed in provision of accommodations. So we work pretty closely with faculty as we establish accommodations, especially if they have questions on how to implement those accommodations. All right, so getting started with CAR really starts after enrollment with the CAR application. So complete the CAR application after completing all of the steps to enroll for admission. Then there is the application process, which can be found on our webpage, the CAR webpage, lanecc.edu/disability. And then after that application process is completed, we'll have what is called an initial interview with the student. The student leads this interactive process. We focus on barriers in the learning environment. We go over FERPA, which is the federal regulation which controls student records at the college level. Basically, we're only allowed to communicate with folks on a need-to-know basis. And so you're absolutely welcome as parents to be a part of that conversation, that initial conversation, but do know that we're always going to ask the student for permission for any parents to or advocates to attend. And we're going to ask that permission every time. And then if, you know, sometimes students have some communicative barriers and may need some assistance from parents or advocates. And so if the student is okay and willing for that parent to speak on their behalf, we're always going to be redirecting any information back directly to the student, because we think it's really important for students to have control over that accommodation process, because it is a student-driven one. We also have some parent and advocate resources. And then we also have some transitioning planning from high school. So I do recommend checking out our webpage. It's got a lot of resources there. And at the end of the presentation, while we cover some questions, I'll put the link to some of these things in the chat. All right, so the next step with getting started for CAR is documentation. So we do typically need some sort of documentation to establish some accommodations. The establishing accommodations, deciding on accommodations really is determined by that interactive process piece and the student's narrative. But we do need some student disability verification. And so we have a student disability verification form, or we do also accept other supporting documents, ideally before that initial interview or intake appointment. So it can be reviewed prior to the conversation. That intake appointment, that initial conversation can occur without documentation on file, but it really does help fill in some gaps that, you know, we may hear in the conversation. And we can also discuss further avenues for obtaining any documentation during the intake. And it really should, that documentation really should be geared toward what the disability is. And then the key piece is like, what are the functional impacts of that disability? What are the barriers that are created in the learning environment as it interacts with the disability? Documentation, like I said, should support the student's current narrative around disability related to barriers and fill in those gaps, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee accommodations. You know, like I said, we're really going to be relying on that student narrative piece and the student experience. Okay, so working with CAR, support provided. CAR contacts students to schedule an intake appointment after the application's been received with an accommodation specialist. After intake, students are encouraged to check in with their assigned accommodation specialist at least once per term about how accommodations may be going, if any issues arise with accommodations, or if any further barriers arrive. It very much is an interactive process. You know, we really try to understand what the student's experience is and the ways in which that we can remove those barriers. So it might be ongoing, things might evolve. disability isn't necessarily static. It can evolve over time. And so there may be some new barriers that come along that need accommodation, and there may be some previous accommodations that are no longer appropriate. So we really try to look at it as an evolving or changing thing. So during check-ins, accommodations are reviewed and any additional support resources and learning strategies are discussed. We really like meeting with students once per term. If some students like meeting with us more frequently, that's fine too. We generally ask that students meet with us at the very bare minimum once per year to keep their services active, but generally once per term is fine, unless there are some other challenges or barriers arising. All right, so working with CAR, supports provided continued. Students have access to CAR Connections, which is our Moodle page with helpful information for students utilizing CAR services. It's currently in the remodel process right now. That's actually one of my projects currently. I'm hoping to have it fully complete at the beginning of summer term. And it really is planned to be a very robust resource. It has everything from CAR processes to campus resources to outside strategies and resources, guides for utilizing accessible technology, strategies around communicating with instructors, all sorts of good stuff. And then we also have a tech lab that's available for students to use. It's very quiet if a student needs to use the space as a study space. There's computers with lots of assistive tech at it, screen readers, text-to-speech programs. I think we even have some dictation set up in there if any student is needing to use some speech to text. And then students also receive regular communication from CAR with timely information related to services and larger academic and college navigation and planning. We send out a weekly email blast to students, so we definitely recommend students check their email regularly. I am the editor of those CAR email blasts, and we've done a really good job, in my opinion, of creating robust, timely resources. So definitely recommend that students check that out on a regular basis. All right, so working with CAR, requesting accommodations. After accommodations are set up, students must request them each term for each of their classes, ideally at the start of each term. So accommodations are always attached to a specific class. So every term that a student's wanting to use their accommodations, they'll need to log into what we call the AIM portal. It's what we use to track accommodation requests and send out letters of accommodation to instructors. And so that needs to happen each term because it's always tied to a specific class that lets us know which instructor to send the letter of accommodation to. And then if a student drops a class and adds another in its place, accommodations do need to be requested for that new class. It's not just kind of a one and done thing. It really is tied to the specific class, because there may be some situations where, a student has these accommodations in place. They might not be applicable for let's say an art class, but they are applicable to a math class, or they might not need accommodations for a PE class, but they'll definitely need them for an anthropology class, something like that. And then students should connect with their instructors at the beginning of the term to discuss the facilitation of certain accommodations, or as soon as they're established. We can establish accommodations throughout the term, but do know, and this is really important, accommodations aren't retroactive at all. They're always going forward from the time that they're requested in the AIM portal. And then they do need to be requested in AIM for every class each term that the student wants to use them in. And so what I mean by not retroactive, if let's say a student forgets to put their accommodation request in at the beginning of the term, and they have an exam that first week or second week, because exams in the first week aren't very typical, and they're wanting to use test accommodations. Well, if they haven't put that request in, the instructor's not going to know that they have testing accommodations. And so that, like, let's say they have extra test time, that extra test time is not going to be applied. And so they wouldn't have the opportunity to go back and reopen that exam with the extra time if it's not applied, if they haven't received that letter of accommodation. And so we really encourage students to get those accommodation requests in before the term starts. Typically, we open the AIM portal for the next term's accommodation request about a month prior to the start of the term. So there is lots of time available, and we send out quite a few reminders to get those accommodation requests in. All right, so resources, some information linked in this presentation. There's some information on FERPA. Again, that's that confidentiality piece around student information, steps to enroll for admissions to a lane, CARS application and application process details, parents and advocates, transition planning for high school students, disability verification form and disability verification documentation, additional student information and resources, CARS contact information, CARS website, accessible resources at lanecc.edu, and then our phone number 541-463-5150. We're again in building 19, room 263A. Come visit us. We're generally open from Mondays through Fridays. That's going to change a little bit during the summer term as the college is closed during Fridays. And then we're open from 8:30 to 4. There are sometimes where our office might be closed for just a minute if people need to step out for breaks or lunch, but we typically have someone in there at all times. And you know, if the office is closed, maybe peek down our hallway into our tech lab, there might be someone in there that can help you.